backyard playing?
We were downtown shopping at Penny's. I was in the kitchen cooking supper.
I was driving home from work.
We were getting ready to go to church.
It was Good Friday, you know.
This was my town. These were my people. And as I realized what massive destruction it was, I became heartsick.
Electric power, telephone, all of our water and sewer were out of service. At that time, of course, the city did not know whether we would have help from other people.
The disaster struck at the heart of the state. The south central area hit by the quake contains almost half the total population of Alaska. In and around Anchorage, where most Alaskans live, homes, schools, stores and offices, automobiles, business and industrial facilities were damaged or destroyed. An early survey indicated almost complete destruction of the Turn-Again residential area. Severe damage was also reported in the downtown business area. From almost the center of town, a 30-foot deep fissure ran through 4th Avenue.
I couldn't get through because of the cracks in the pavement.
The pavement began to crack underneath our feet. When the rumbling and the waving of the earth had ceased, we looked around and discovered that the buildings on 4th Avenue had been completely demolished.
We found out the damage was severe. The city of Anchorage had been hit real hard. Of course, our communications were out throughout the state. Our power was off. Very bad reports filtered in throughout the night from the outlying areas. We did realize we'd had a very bad earthquake.
Water was short. Electrical power had failed. Food stocks, it was feared, had been destroyed. In a few short minutes on that Good Friday afternoon, the lives, the health, the safety, the possessions, and even more, the hope for the future of half the people in Alaska had been threatened. And Anchorage was not the only place hard hit.
There were other areas in the state that were more severely stricken than the city of Anchorage. Though they were smaller, some of them were completely wiped out or almost totally paralyzed by the damage. The city of Seward was a sad, sad sight to Alaskans.
Seward was struck by a tidal wave. Docks and buildings were damaged. Fuel oil tanks in the city burst into flames. Bridges on railroad and highway routes approaching the town had been destroyed. Landslides had also severed the railroad and the highway routes to Seward. Aircraft alone could bring help to the stricken city. In Valdez, the waterfront was destroyed by the tidal wave that followed the quake. The business district burned. Army troops moved in to evacuate all civilians from the area. In Whittier, oil storage tanks burned out and docks were destroyed. Alaska, entirely dependent on the sea, or almost so, was left by the quake with no seaport facilities. All her docks had been destroyed. Homer was also washed by the tidal waves that followed the earthquake, small craft and other property destroyed. At Kodiak, the damage was severe. Stores, harbor facilities, homes, and the fishing craft on which these seafaring people depend for their living were destroyed. Lives were lost as the tidal wave came rolling in. Old Harbor, an Indian village on Kodiak Island, was almost completely destroyed. The homes of over 200 people swept away.
At the time of the earthquake, I was away on a boat over to Port Holborn, the American whaling station that was closed down for 30 or 40 years. First, we didn't know what it was that was happening until we seen the rocks falling down from the mountains all around us. We started running away from the shore. We looked back, it was low tide, and we noticed that the tide was falling extra faster. So we gave the boat full throttle as fast as it can go to get back here to Old Harbor. It was our first thought something happened over here. We came back awful fast. We came through the channel. We noticed the village was dark. We didn't see any light plants, and we didn't see any people, which made us real scared as we came through the Narrows. We came here full speed, and just before we got to the mooring, someone noticed the people on top of the hill. I ran to our home, which was over here. I guess I can't even about point out the place where it was. It's all gone.
Bad as things were for the Old Harbor Indians that night, for others they were even worse. Over 100 Alaskans were dead or missing and believed dead. Others were injured. Scores were homeless. Half the people in the state had suffered some loss. Some had lost everything they owned. But there was no disorder, no panic, no looting. Few of those most directly affected by the quake seemed to feel as helpless as they were. None seemed hopeless. And yet these people urgently needed help.
It became very evident that Alaska had sustained a very severe earthquake.
As the night wore on, we began to realize actually how widespread this disaster was. And we began to wonder, does the outside world know that we have been completely cut off?
From the point of view of an Alaskan, I think the word that most occupies the mind is alone. Because in Alaska, we feel very far away. Now, this feeling has been removed to a great extent by the fact that the people who have come here to help us, to find out what we need, have in fact come here. It's very reassuring to an Alaskan who feels so far away from the other United States to know that congressmen, senators, people of great import have gotten on planes and come up to Alaska to find out what has happened.
On Saturday, the Office of Emergency Planning arrived on the scene.
As the Office of Emergency Planning began its operations, we here in Alaska fully realized what it was to have such tremendous assistance.
The Office of Emergency Planning, OEP, was created in 1961. In any peacetime emergency or disaster like this one in Alaska, OEP, as a staff arm of the President of the United States, coordinates all disaster activities of all other agencies. We naturally got to Anchorage as soon as possible after the quake, leaving Seattle-Tacoma Airport on the first available aircraft at 7:30 Saturday morning. As regional director for this area, I headed the OEP staff in Anchorage. My name is Creeth Tooley. Ray Willman, our natural disaster coordinator, was also there, as was John Makey, regional representative. We were all from OEP's Region 8 offices in Everett, Washington. Ralph Burns, natural disaster coordinator of Region 7 in Santa Rosa, California, came to Anchorage too. Our job was to coordinate plans and policies of all city, state, and federal agencies for mobilizing whatever resources might be needed to meet this particular emergency.
Edward A. McDermott, director of the Office of Emergency Planning, arrived in Anchorage on the presidential plane, Air Force One, accompanied by Alaska's 2 senators, E.L. Bob Bartlett and Ernest Greening, who rushed in to meet with Governor Egan. The director met at once with city and state officials to make immediate plans for necessary help. People forget how many agencies perform the normal functions of our peacetime life, or how many different officials may come together on the spot when things go wrong. To Alaska, now there were coming, or there would come, a cabinet member, a roving ambassador, senators, members of President Johnson's Special Commission to study earthquake damage and map long-range plans for Alaska's recovery. officials of the Red Cross, the Salvation Army, and other private organizations, as well as all those working for the many federal agencies involved in a disaster of this magnitude. The Corps of Engineers to repair flood control facilities, the Small Business Administration to make small loans, the Treasury Department to make big ones, the Department of Defense to help protect lives and property, the General Services Administration to offer surplus goods, the Public Health Service to save lives, the Department of Agriculture with surplus foods. There were people, too, from the Bureau of Public Roads, from the Federal Housing Administration, from the Department of the Interior, the Veterans Administration, the Bureau of Indian Affairs. There were, or there would be coming, others from the Departments of Labor, Commerce, Health, Education, and Welfare, from the Housing, Home, and Finance Agency, the Internal Revenue Service, the Federal Communications Commission, and the Federal Aviation Agency, the U.S. Weather Bureau, the Interstate Commerce Commission, the Bureau of Mines. And there were, or there would be, people from the Alaskan Railroad, from the fisheries and canneries, from the big oil companies whose tanks had burned, and from other businesses and industries with facilities and investments in the damaged area. All these people, and a literal host of other state and city officials, and members of other private organizations, had shared in the disaster, and would have a hand in whatever plans would be made for Alaska's recovery. It was Mr. McDermott's job and OEP's responsibility to see that all the work of all these people and these agencies made sense. He had to see, therefore, the damage that had been done, the problems with which the staff in Anchorage would have to deal. Sometimes the air is so clear and clean in Alaska that the colors all seem true, right out of the painter's box. And the definition of every scene is as sharp and bright as a landscape laid out with a straight edge and painted by a draftsman or an engineer. The frozen mountains are there, and the ice-cold sea. That's the way things looked from the air when the earth had finally settled down once more and only trembled somewhat now and then. You could feel the challenge this country holds for its people.
There was no panic. There was a sense of helping each other through the crisis.
We were working desperately to get everything back in shape as soon as possible.
Even from the air, you could see the damage plainly enough. It was pretty severe in the Turn-Again residential area in Anchorage. It was bad in downtown Anchorage. There was only rubble now where there had been whole blocks of stores. From the air, you could see in less detail, but on a much broader scale, how badly Seward had been hit. You could see the wholesale destruction at Valdez. You could also see how the tidal wave washing over Homer had left a puddle of sea in its wake. And you could see the desolation on Kodiak Island, too. Realize with a shock that the Indian village that used to nestle along this shore is now completely gone. Gone with the tidal waves that swept in from the sea.
2 or 3 houses broke loose. I was on the hill up there, just like a bird in its nest, watching everything go on below it. I guess the whole village had a bird's eye view of the houses and everything. Then the water went way out, and this time it dried the bay up right in half. And we were all just shocked and didn't know what to think. It was horrible. And we didn't know if it was going to be any worse. We figured the damage had done already. And then it came roaring down through that pass, and the tide was raising at that time. And this time when the water came in, it flooded up all over, up into that pass up there. And then when the water swept back out, it took all the houses out to sea with it.
Leaving only their school, their church, and 1 or 2 other buildings intact but ruined by the sea. But back at Anchorage again. Seeing that time when the disaster had struck still set on the face of a shocked and broken clock, there was the conviction that all this would be fixed. The damage would ultimately be repaired. Alaska would recover. The process of recovery had already been set in motion and was underway. The big job of cleaning up after the earthquake had begun. From emergency funds available to the President under Public Law 875, a check for $5 million was presented to the people of Alaska shortly after the quake had struck. Within a matter of just a few days' time, an additional $50 million had been appropriated by Congress for the President's disaster fund. On March 30th, the Monday morning only 2 days after the catastrophe, Mr. McDermott returned to Washington to report on the effectiveness of both civil and military agencies concerned in meeting what he called perhaps the greatest natural disaster in the recorded history of North America. One of the most edifying experiences I have had, Mr. McDermott said, was to observe the spirit of the people of Anchorage and other Alaskan cities in the midst of devastation.
The director of each OEP regional office is delegated the responsibility for directing and coordinating federal disaster relief activities within his region. Funds made available by the President for disaster relief may be used for the following purposes: for performing protective work essential for the protection of life and property, performing emergency health and sanitation measures, clearing debris and wreckage, and making emergency repairs and temporary replacement of essential public facilities of states and local governments damaged or destroyed in such major disasters. This includes provisions for temporary housing or emergency shelter.
The responsibility of OEP officials in the field centered in Anchorage. There in the City Hall Annex, the one-time school building in which their temporary office was set up, daily meetings were held. At each day's meeting, plans were made and policies set to meet the most immediate and pressing problems. Each meeting opened with a general report from Creeth Tooley, who served as the presiding officer.
As of this morning, 26 people are known dead, 79 are missing and presumed dead, but this does not include the casualties in the Turnagain area. 56 have been injured and hospitalized. Damage estimates have been revised as of today to $209 million in public and $24,546,000 in private property.
The final estimate exceeded these figures, reaching a total of $295 million in public and private property damaged or destroyed. Then officials representing other agencies reported on their findings and activities, on troubles encountered and needs that had developed the day before. The Corps of Engineers reported they were continuing inspection and awarding contracts for emergency repairs to Elmendorf Air Force Base and to Fort Richardson. OEP gave district engineers a verbal go-ahead to undertake all federal restoration and cleanup assistance in Anchorage and Seward. Advance teams were already in Valdez and Seward. Crash programs were underway to locate construction camps and barges. Additional engineers were coming in from Seattle, and more were due to arrive. The Navy and Bureau of Yards and Docks were ordered to continue technical assistance to Kodiak and to perform all cleanup and restoration of essential facilities there. On the road to Seward, 17 bridges were reported out. Snow and landslides blocked the highway. Cracks in its surface would have to be filled. The railroad was in no better shape. Much of its equipment had been damaged or destroyed. The right-of-way had also been blocked by slides, washouts, bridges destroyed, and trackage no longer considered safe. The railroad was very aggressive in moving ahead with restoration. Service, it was reported, would be restored in 2 weeks on most of the line. Red Cross officials reported on what they had done so far and were prepared to do in assisting people left homeless by the quake. Food, clothing, help, and comfort were being provided. The Salvation Army reported on its part in distributing emergency supplies and also in giving aid and comfort to victims of the quake. It was generally agreed that there were no major problems regarding the present availability of food supplies. And the reports continued. The work still waiting to be done was planned. Engineering and eligibility criteria were established for the restoration of schools and other public buildings destroyed in Anchorage. Boys like this were still idle and doubtless longing to return to the classroom and creative but properly supervised activities. There was nothing now for the kids to do but play, a state of affairs that would have to be corrected soon. There was no martial law anywhere in Alaska, all during this emergency. All military services continued to furnish, however, basic support in critical areas. Supplies were airlifted in military planes. 121 refugees from the city of Kodiak were airlifted to Seattle. And 279 natives from Old Harbor and elsewhere on Kodiak Island were evacuated to Anchorage, where they were temporarily housed in the Airport Heights School. A great many other rescue flights were made by military aircraft during the emergency. Without such flights, many Alaskans might have been lost, their towns and cities isolated and cut off for days. With roads and railroads blocked, aircraft became Alaska's only means of long-distance transportation and her only link with the world outside. For all Alaskan ports were closed, except the Anchorage City Port, and this was operative only on a limited basis. With immediate recovery of Seward and Valdez extremely doubtful, and with Whittier cut off by the blocked and inoperative railroad, the restoration of Anchorage port facilities was a prime necessity. But there was confidence everywhere. The State Commerce Commission advised that all banks in the state were open and operating without incident. Anchorage banks reported more deposits than withdrawals on their first day open after the quake, even though temporary banking facilities sometimes had to be devised. For even then, almost immediately after the quake, Alaskans could feel secure and even somewhat cheerful about their plight, no matter what damage their homes, their cars, their stores and offices and shops may have sustained.
Our bookstore had sunk many feet down into the earth, and our second story had fallen down. After several days, we were allowed to go back to the store and salvage as many books as we could. We, of course, had to look for a new location, as did many people in the area. We found a much smaller store, and we've since been trying to squeeze all our books into this very tiny space. We're very optimistic about the future, though, and we have many plans to build a better bookstore.
Great hope came to us when we got the word that President Johnson had declared Alaska a major disaster area. The following day, just less than 24 hours after the earthquake shook us to our very roots, the Office of Emergency Planning was landing at Elmendorf Air Force Base right near Anchorage here to take over and assist us in our recovery efforts. In a few short hours, they had undertaken a tremendous task.
Stayed 2 nights at Navy Barracks, CB Barracks, where they treated us real good. They gave us chow. It was good to be on someplace solid. And then from there, they flew us up to Anchorage. They had a temporary quarters at school, but they couldn't keep us long there because the school was to be open again. They moved us out to Camp Denali, the Army National Guard station. They gave us quarters there, and we lived there until we returned here to start construction.
It was through the immediate action of OEP that Alaska was able to recover as quickly as it has. Without this valuable assistance, Alaska would be far from the recovery stages that we are now in. It would have entailed passage of new laws. It would have entailed funding, indebting the state tremendously in order to assist the population, assist the cities in their recovery efforts.
One of the things that one thinks about when one is as far away from the other United States as Alaska is representation. We wonder if we are part of the family. And when our political fathers come to check on our well-being, this is reassuring. And we know that we are, in fact, part of the family that is America.
What you have seen here is just a handful of individual Alaskans, some of them too small to testify. The shock of that Good Friday afternoon is over now, and life goes on. But Alaska has not yet fully recovered from what OEP Director Edward A. McDermott rightly called the greatest natural disaster in the recorded history of North America. it will be years before its recovery is complete. The extent of the damage and the loss sustained can be measured only in part by the amount of money earmarked for the state. More than $240 million granted or appropriated by the federal government to help Alaskans rebuild their schools and homes, their stores and offices and industries, and to restore defense and other government facilities within the state. Yet because of this, because of the President's immediate response to Alaska's need, because the Office of Emergency Planning had been set up to function effectively at once whenever a disaster of this kind may strike, Alaskans began almost at once to rebuild. Work begun the very morning after the quake was well underway a few weeks later. Their harbor destroyed by tidal waves that followed the quake, Kodiak residents with OEP and Navy help built a small boat harbor in nearby Gibson Cove. To repair the commercial fishing boats on which Kodiak's life almost depends, OEP funded and the Navy shipped from San Diego a floating dry dock to replace one lost in the disaster. Crab fishermen had gone to sea again, and the canneries were back at work. At Old Harbor, an emergency tent city had been built by the villagers with help from OEP, the Red Cross, and the Bureau of Indian Affairs. The men were impatient only to rebuild more permanent homes in the few short weeks of summer before the frost set in again. In Kodiak, the Red Cross loaded a ship with furniture for Old Harbor families still huddled in their tents. The railroad, Alaska's vital link between its seaports and its inland towns, had been repaired, but trains were once more running. Roads were open and the big trucks rolling in. The port of Anchorage was open and working too, unloading ships to land much-needed supplies, automobiles, equipment, clothing, lumber, and other supplies lost in the quake. Unloading ships, unloading planes. Wherever you looked in those first few weeks, you could see Alaskans at work. They pulled down structures damaged by the shock. They cleaned up the debris left in the disaster's wake. Disrupted utilities were repaired and service restored. They laid down temporary water lines and graded the land torn open by the quake, and sometimes rolled into ravines that ran like waves across their towns. This was the present to which Alaskans awoke with a shock on Good Friday afternoon of 1964. But a few weeks, even a few days later, the city was back to something like its normal life. But what of the future? The children have gone back to school. In what kind of cities and towns will they grow and live in years to come? What lessons will Alaskans and all of us learn from the great disaster of that Good Friday afternoon in 1964? Led by Senator Clinton P. Anderson of New Mexico, the special commission established by a presidential proclamation on April 2nd, just 6 days following the quake, came to Alaska to plan reconstruction of the state's facilities with an eye to future long-range needs. We want to make sure, Senator Anderson said, that what we spend money on is not necessarily what was there before, but what will be needed for the future. With this kind of federal support, Alaskans have more than met the challenge of the present. They are preparing to meet the challenge of the future, too, drilling into their uncertain ground, probing to find what lies below, determined to outguess by design, to rebuild, to plan, and so to ensure against another disaster of the kind that struck on March 27, 1964 at 5:36 p.m.